let's start attaching the binding to our quilt. I have a table beside me and it is helping to support the rest of the quilt that isn't going to be going underneath the machine. I have my binding handy and all rolled up. And for when I need them, I do have some clips. In place of these, a smaller binder clip would also work really well if that's something that you have. I'm not sure how much they are to purchase, say compared to some of these specialty clips, but they will do in a pinch if you don't have any other options. The method that I'm going to use to attach my binding is an attach to the back and pull around to the front, and then I'm going to stitch it down from the front. And when I stitch from the front, I'm going to stitch really close down to the edge, so that way I end up with a little bit of like kind of a flange, and it allows me to kind of keep the front looking good, and the back, wherever that line of stitching falls in the back, no one's really going to see it. And I'm going to be trying to use a coordinating thread color for the back anyway, so it doesn't really show up. With my roll of binding here, I do have a handy spot on my sewing table where I can put this, and it actually just happens to be the arm that allows the table to drop down or open up for my sewing machine. But I can hook my roll around here, and it's kind of got to go around a little corner there, so I'm not worried about it falling off or flying anywhere. I do kind of have to make sure it is going a direction that's going to allow it to roll off with the raw edge facing out. So when I go to sew it down to my machine, or sew it down to my quilt, it's easy enough for the raw edges to be aligned without having a twist. So that's my little kind of binding off the roll hack here. So I'm going to start about halfway down, and when I'm laying this out along my side here, I want to leave myself a little bit of room. I don't want to start just sewing right from my edge here. When I get back and I've attached this all the way around, I get back to this point, I'm going to need to join this end to the other one coming in from this side. And I need a little bit of room on both sides of my fabric to be able to do that comfortably. So I'm going to give myself probably about kind of maybe a hand's width before like extra here to work with. So I'm going to move this underneath my machine, and this doesn't necessarily need to be a 1/4 inch. Usually I tend to go closer to kind of a 3/8 of an inch. So I am just going to slide my little green tape bit here over. And so in addition to this, I always find it helpful to look for other parts of my presser foot that I can line everything up to. And the outer edge of my presser foot here is also in line with the outside edge. So I know I've got some extra space at the beginning with my 1/4 inch foot, but I can always look past that to this part here further back and know that things are lining up. And I've got my green tape here to also help act as a bit of a buffer to help with that. So now I do want to make sure I am back stitching at this point. There aren't normally very many stages within making a quilt that I would choose to back stitch, but this is one of them. And that's just when you get to joining at the ends, there's a little more pressure that can end up on your stitching there, and having that back stitched will just help hold everything securely in place. I have opted to keep my stitch length at 2.5 for this. There's quite a lot of fabric that's being stitched through, so 2.5 is not going to be, too long in this scenario. And these stitches are also going to be completely folded over later on. So right now, it doesn't matter what you're using for thread color in your top or the bobbin. No one's going to see this part. And as you go, just make sure that you've got a little bit of tightness happening, like on everything. Make sure everything's good and kind of taut. You don't want to pull so hard to stretch or pull so hard that you're preventing the fabric from moving underneath your needle, but you do want everything to be nice and flat as you go along. So not too much, like this has got a good amount of stretch in it. So you want it to be just kind of a firmness as you stitch this all down. And do make sure that you haven't stitched down the folded end. You want to make sure your raw edges are stitched down because this is going to fold over and around your quilt to the front, and you'll be stitching down from the front. So you want your folded end to be the part that wraps around. I'm approaching my corner here. However far that you have stitched away from this edge and in my case about more of a 3/8 of an inch instead of a 1/4 inch, you want to try to make sure that you're stopping that same distance back from this edge. And then you're going to do a little back stitch in there. There is a little bit of a process to these corners. And the first one is you don't want to sew right to the end. That was weird. So on my presser foot, I do have some 1/4 inch markings. So I have one that's at the back, right, kind of aligned with the needle. And then I have this one here, so I know that this is a 1/4 inch. So I want to kind of, as I'm looking at where this needle is, or the foot is pressing down, I know that I'm not quite to the edge here, but just slightly beyond that first red mark on my presser foot. So I'm going to do a couple of back stitches in here and forward one more time. And I'm going to then just remove this from underneath my needle. There is a bit of a folding process with the binding at this stage. So you want to take it and lift it straight up. And I even actually have a little bit of a guide here because of how I quilted. You want to create a 45-degree fold. Or in this case, if the binding were to be an extension of the edge of my quilt, it's just going to be a straight extension up. And I'm going to give that a little bit of a kind of a crease here, press down with my fingernails, help keep that in place. And I'm going to now bring this back down, but I'm leaving my finger right here. I'm going to fold along the top edge of this quilt. I don't want to open or pull down too far. So the next folding crease is going to align at the top part of my quilt here. This is going to give me that mitered corner look when I pull everything around to the front of my quilt. And then to do my next stitches, just like how, and I'll kind of show you here, because now we've got this extra bit, just like how we stopped early here. And if you can almost maybe see where that crease was, you can see my stitches stop right in line with where it's creased. I want to make sure that I'm in that same distance on this side, kind of that 3/8, and I'm starting with my first stitches here. So you're actually going to have a tiny little bit of this that sort of remains open, but when you're folding this around to the front, this is all going to be closed up. You do not have a hole here. And I'm going to kind of look for, so I have these 1/4 inch markings, and if I lined up the back edge of my quilt to the 1/4 inch on my foot, I know that I've got that, I would drop the needle 1/4 of an inch in, but I need it to be just a little bit further than that. So push it just behind, and I'm going to, might actually just drop down my presser foot. There we go. So with my presser foot down, I have a better view of exactly how far in my needle is going to drop. And I'm happy with where that's at, so I'm going to let my needle go down. I will take a couple of stitches forward and then a couple back, just to make sure that corner is not going to come apart. Okay, so now that's finished, I can go along and quickly sew up the rest of this line until I get to the next corner. I'm almost at the second corner, and I thought I would go through this just one more time. So as I approach that corner, I want to make sure that I'm stopping before the end the same amount of distance that I'm stitching in on this side. So approximately that 3/8 inch. And I'm going to use the markings on my presser foot to help me with that. So my front red mark on my presser foot is showing me that that's that 1/4 inch from the needle point. And I want to be just almost there, but not quite. Let's see, that's looking pretty close. So I'm going to back stitch now, give a couple, and come back at least one or twice, and lift up and release it. You don't necessarily have to break thread here if you're comfortable with turning the whole thing kind of underneath in your needle area. But for me, I find it much easier to break the thread and close this off with a back stitch and start this with a brand new front stitch. So I've got my quilt turned now. Give myself a little extra here to work with. And so just like before, I'm going to flip this up, and I want to try and make sure I have a nice clean angle happening here, and that when I flip this up, that this is just my raw edge here is the continuation of the quilt, and that they line up, because when I flip this back down, I want my raw edge to match along the side of my quilt here again. So if I do this and I'm not at the right angle, or I don't go, if I sewed too far this way, I might not be able to flip up my raw edge the same way here, and it's going to be over. And you don't want to be too far back either and have this not line up. So make sure as you're folding and you've flipped up that everything is lined up on your raw edges from the quilt to the binding. Give that a nice press with your finger. It'll help hold those creases in place for you. And then you'll flip it back down, so that way you've got a finished fold line here along the top edge of your corner. And this part, I mean, it can definitely be helpful to grab an extra clip or pin just to keep things secure. I'm going to put my quilting glove back on. Work on aligning underneath here. When I'm close to this alignment, if you've put a clip in there, then, you know, maybe just remove that before you stitch. At this point, I've got a good enough hold on it with my fingers. Oh. And I'm going to use my presser foot, again, the red markings, because I want to make sure I'm starting my first stitch. If it's 3/8 inch in from the edge here, it also needs to be 3/8 down from the top. So just a little bit behind that red mark, drop my presser foot, and I feel like I'm a little bit too far back. There we go. That looks better to me. And you just need to be close, not exact with that. You know, your stitch and the thread and all are a little bit forgiving. You just don't want to be starting too far back, otherwise you will have trouble getting it to go around that corner. And a couple stitches forwards, a couple back. There's lots of pressure that goes on those corners, so you want them to be well secured there. And now I'm ready to stitch down the rest of this side. So there's still a couple more corners to go. I will go ahead and just complete that, and the next part will be talking about joining your ends from where we started to where we're ending. I got a little bit carried away with what I was doing and forgot that I needed to show this part. So we are going to pretend that these are still attached and sewn together here. And what you want to do is take a little bit off the end of your binding, and you're going to use this to help you measure out how much you need to have of an overlap between your two end pieces, and then to know where to cut. So we'll just pretend that this line is a lot, you know, longer out here, and you want to make sure things are just kind of smoothed out a little bit, fairly straight, flat. I do find it easier to bring one part of my binding a little bit higher up, just so I can kind of see when I'm comparing this. And you want to take your fabric and open it up so that you've got that 2.5 inch width showing. And in this case, I have a little bit of selvage end on here, and I'm not going to sew through that. I'm going to use it to help me when I'm stitching my last corner through. So I've lined up my piece here to know where I need to cut, and I've lined it kind of to the edge of the selvage edge. And then it is, and I prefer to have an overlap when I'm making my corner to corner stitch. So I've got a little bit of extra over here. So I'm going to have to remember that I've got about 1/4 inch that needs to overlap on this side, plus making sure that my selvage end does not get sewn over. And I can create that V shape that happened when we were first sewing all of our binding pieces together to create that diagonal stitch line there. So once you know how much you need, then you will cut off the extra end bit of your binding. And I have maybe about 20 inches. This was a little bit longer, but I used some of it to go around a label over here so that I had a finished end when I was stitching everything down afterwards. Okay, so the next part is at the sewing machine. for this part, I want you to remember how you had joined your ends together before sewing on your binding. And if you remember that V shape that we had talked about, you're going to create that V shape again in the same direction. So your upper piece here is going to open up, facing up, and then your bottom piece is going to also do the same thing, except that right sides are together. And then you'll align them up here, and I had allowed myself some extra room with the selvage edge, so I want to make sure that is clear of the other edge of my binding piece. And I had allowed for this here to have some extra room to create these little mini V's to help align everything up underneath the needle. So I'm going to give these a pin to help hold them together. Okay, and you might be able to see a little bit of a previous stitch line here. It did work out in terms of not having a twist. However, it was a little bit too loose in the binding. I didn't bring my pieces overlapping enough, and I felt like I needed to try this again just to shorten up how much I had here. So put my needle down, and my quilt here is kind of wadded up so that way I have as much of my binding here kind of as slack as it can be, so I'm not fighting so much with it and the pins underneath the machine. My threads out to the back. Make sure that V here is kind of right centered around my needle. It's down, and I have this V right to that red line. Or if you had, if you don't have tape to follow that line, then you would be drawing this out with a pencil or a pen. Remove these pins, and then you're going to kind of pull this tight, and you'll be able to tell right away if you stitched these in the correct direction. If you didn't, your binding would have a twist in it, and you would know that you needed to take it out and try again. But the main trick though is just remembering to keep that V in the same direction as when you were attaching all your binding pieces together. And I'm going to cut off my extra now with very dull, not fabric scissors, because those are not up here at my sewing machine. And I'm going to give this just a finger press open. And then I'm just going to kind of finger press along the original ironed outline here. I find most of the time, because everything had been well ironed, especially this crease along here, it just wants to go back to that. So once you get the inside here kind of pressed just a finger press will have everything laying nice and flat for you. And then you are good to go to finish stitching down the rest of your binding. And you can see here when I'm pulling everything flat, it lays flat here. It's not too loose, but I don't have to feel like I have to stretch on here in order to get it to lay nicely across. I have this all attached now. I am going to do a bit of a press on this here first before I work on stitching it down from the front side. I do find that it is much easier to manage if I've taken the iron and I've gone along and I've pushed my binding all the way up. And I don't usually try to like press it on the other side back down, but having it just ready and wanting to be up this way helps create just a nicer crease and flatter line to work with when I'm working on stitching the binding down from the front. I have pressed out my back so it's all flat, and I'm going to be ready to move on to stitching the binding down now from the front. And when I do this from the front, I'm going to be working on getting that needle and stitch line as close to the edge as I possibly can. With this stage, having some sort of clip is very helpful. It does help keep everything down for you in place while you're sewing along. And I thought I'd start just a little bit closer to a corner here so I can talk about how to fold that corner over. So I try to make sure everything is well clipped down, kind of in both areas leading up to that corner. And then I usually get something, I have this stylus, but anything that's kind of narrow and flat will be helpful. And I kind of push this all the way over kind of to the edge here as much as I can. And then I'm going to turn or fold this corner down over top of that. And it creates kind of that corner join look right here on the edge. And sometimes this takes just a little bit of kind of fussing with the fabric in the area a bit to get it to lay for you. I do find though that the more I can manage to press this and get a nice tuck here, the easier it is for this side to come down and create that fold. And then I just take a clip and I put right over top of that. And sometimes I just go crazy with the clips and put a few more nice and close to here. By the time I have stitched down to this point, the clips have almost kind of created a crease sort of in the fabric, and it already kind of stays, which makes it a lot easier when I'm stitching through there. So let's move on to the sewing stage. I have slid my sewing needle all the way over to the left as far as my machine will allow. and I opted to put in a different foot. And this foot here, it just came with my machine, so nothing special that I purchased. But it does have one part of the presser foot where it's sort of designed to sew things off maybe onto that left-hand side, since the kind of that metal part can run along the outside of the quilt. And then I have the rest of the presser foot that's going to come in and glide over top of the rest of my binding. And when my needle is all the way over, and I can kind of see there's a little bit of an opening here in between the two parts of that foot. And I'm going to be guiding my binding part here along, so that way it's kind of fitting in between those two and as close to the silver part as I can get it. And that's going to let me have a fairly consistent, like, straight line on the top look, and a very close stitch to the edge without being off the edge. And with this stage, you need to go very slowly and carefully. You don't want to miss and stitch off necessarily. Or if you wanted to do something very different, you could actually just use a decorative stitch and aim for that decorative stitch to be half on your binding and like half off. And so then it kind of doesn't really matter how things look on the front or the back. So that's kind of another option if you're not wanting something that's totally a straight line, or just to fancy up your quilt edge a little bit here. But I do like just doing that straight stitch line along the top here. And as I go and these pieces, my clips here, move closer in, I'll be moving them out of the way, but I'll be stopping fairly frequently too, just to kind of reposition and make sure I'm happy with how my binding has rolled over and is laying down on the top. So let's take these first couple of stitches. And always, I like to do a little back stitch here at the beginning. Okay, so we are getting very close to this stage right here, and I'm going to make sure that I'm happy with how these are laying, and I probably should have done this a little bit sooner, but having a kind of a stylus is really helpful for this stage. Okay, so using the stylus, I can get a little bit closer in than my finger might normally allow for. And I do want to make sure that I'm stitching just a little bit over past that corner there. And I think, there we go, one more. And I will back stitch on these a couple of times, just because usually this can sometimes get a little bit further up the quilt than you want when you go to turn. And now that my needle is down, I'm going to turn my quilt. If your presser foot isn't an auto lift up, you'll need to leave your needle down, but then use the raising bar to lift up your presser foot. Otherwise, you won't be able to get your top here to turn underneath. And I can see that I'm pretty much lined up just right where I want to be. And I am going to take a back stitch in here as well. Because I do want to make sure that that corner isn't going to kind of bust open on me. all a good roll over here. Okay. So let's take a quick look at the back here. The thread choice that I picked for the back is pretty decent because right now, even if it does happen to come up a little bit, it's not terribly noticeable. But there's definitely times where, you know, your back just isn't going to be even. So pick a thread that's going to let everything blend in as best as they can. And there's going to be times where you are pretty much right on and you catch a good stitch in the ditch over here, which is kind of ideally what you want. And the better you're able at managing that, you know, that's, it's great. Okay. And you'll know kind of when you're not, you can hear it because your needle is going to have to work a lot harder to get through some of that extra fabric if you're missing kind of that ditch or even further out into your quilt. So don't stress too much about what the back of your quilt looks like. You're not really going to ever be, seeing that or scrutinizing that part. Just work on trying to get a nice even to the edge stitch along the front of your quilt and as close as you can to the edge, and that will give you a nice little top stitch going on that makes your binding on the front just a little bit more decorative.